today, but you can't have failed to notice that for the last 2 days, he's dominated your TV screen. Unfortunately, this high-profile visit coincided with some of the worst border incursions, which means, along with the hype and expectation, there was also considerable tension and apprehension. So tonight, in a special one-hour discussion, we ask, how has the visit gone off? Are India-China relations poised for a significant step forward? And has China made substantial economic commitments to India's development, despite the fact that $100 billion figure has not been met? And now joining me to analyze the Chinese president's visit and where the relationship between the two countries stands is India's former ambassador to China, Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, the geostrategic director of the IISS, Sanjay Baru, a senior fellow from Shivnadar University and the former editor of the Hindu newspaper, Siddharth Varadarajan, who will be with us shortly, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times and a member of the National Security Advisory Board, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, who will also be with us shortly. But with me by Spike from Beijing, the India Today Group's Beijing correspondent, Anant Krishnan. Mr. Das Gupta, let me start with the issue that not just intrigues people, but perhaps even disturbs many people. On the one hand, you have a very high-profile visit which started in Ahmedabad, then triumphed in Delhi, and a very public bonhomie and display of friendship between the two heads of government. And on the other hand, you have some of the worst ever border incursions in Demchuk and Shumur, with perhaps the media saying 1,500 soldiers standing eyeball to eyeball. What do you make of this combination?
I'm not sure I'd describe it as one of the worst ever incursions. The number of personnel involved on either side was certainly large. But I mean, there are that doesn't. It's not the only factor in the.
Except the media has been calling it across all channels the worst ever.
And I'm not sure that that's accurate.
But is the combination of incursions and a visit?
No. Having said that, it's certainly very unfortunate that these incursions should have occurred just at this point of time. I understand that the two sides have brought the situation under control. And that there's some sort of an understanding. But certainly it is unfortunate that this incident marred a visit which otherwise has been so fruitful and so important.
Sanjay Baru, if presidential visits that many hope will in fact raise the relationship to a new level can occur alongside with what TV channels are repeatedly calling the worst ever incursions, is this a sign of sophistication in the relationship or a sign of confusion?
No, it's neither a sign of confusion nor sophistication. I think the Chinese are very clear in their mind. They're reminding India where we stand on the border issue. Don't forget that there was a major incident before Lekhe Chang's visit, and this is not happening by accident. Ambassador Das Gupta calls it unfortunate. Of course, it's unfortunate, but I don't think it's unintended. I think the Chinese message is very clear. I mean, they want good economic relations with India. They would like good political relations with India, but they want India to come to terms with what they see as the reality of the border situation. Now, I think our approach should be to remind them that they should also come to terms with the reality of the border situation, particularly in Arunachal Pradesh. So I don't think this is an accident. It is a deliberate strategy of reminding us every time there is a bilateral meeting what they perceive as their position, and certainly they are much stronger and powerful country today than ever before.
Very, very quickly, Ambassador, before I go to Siddharth Varadarajan, is this in a sense a hint of the iron hand behind the soft velvet presentational glove?
I'm afraid I don't agree with Sanjay Baru. If the Chinese had wanted to make the point which he thinks they did, then this incident would have occurred on the eastern sector and not the western sector.
Why eastern and not western?
Because that is where they have claims which are at variance with the realities on the ground, and where our differences are most clear. We are absolutely clear that there can be no major compromise in the eastern sector.
Siddharth Varadarajan, moving beyond the difference of opinion that you've heard between Ambassador Das Gupta and Sanjay Baru, clearly these incursions would have had a substantive impact on the discussions the two heads of government had today. Clearly, they were a major focus of what the two gentlemen spoke about. But do you think these incursions have cast a shadow over the visit, or in an odd way, might the discussions have eased the tension somewhat?
Neither, I think. I think what these incursions have done is reinforced the unsettled, undemarcated nature of the boundary, which is the reality that both India and China have to confront and have to deal with. The fact of the matter is that India and China have had 17 rounds of discussions at the special representatives level to find a solution to the boundary issue that hasn't been very productive. Today, Prime Minister Modi suggested an intermediate step, which is that while discussions for a final settlement carry on, perhaps it's necessary for China and India to resume the process of demarcation, which is obviously a step preliminary to a final settlement, but at least you agree on where the line is. This is not a statement that the Chinese president embraced in his remarks, but he did say that the fact that the boundary is undemarcated is what allows these incidents to happen. I think the two leaderships appear to be seized of the matter. I don't agree with Sanjay Baru that the purpose of these incursions was to show India its place. India is quite capable of standing up to this kind of showmanship, if that is indeed what the Chinese are trying to do. And I think the overriding Chinese goal is to ensure that India, which they see as a swing state, doesn't rush headlong into the embrace of US and Japan and Australia and complete the kind of encirclement that the Chinese consider to be the worst possible outcome in Asia. So if they were to do this by design, these are precisely the kind of incidents which are calculated, which would send India to seek a closer alliance with the US. So I don't think that is the case here. I think the Chinese are quite keen to work with India to find a via media, but it does underline the fact that the boundary issue, you need a mechanism to demarcate and you need a mechanism to de-escalate as and when these incidents occur.
Anand Krishnan, in India the media reports, and you've heard an echo of this from Sanjay Baru a little while ago, that these incursions usually happen just before high-profile visits. It clearly was the case last year when the Chinese Prime Minister came. From the point of view of a correspondent sitting in Beijing who perhaps understands much better than we do how the Chinese system works, is this done deliberately by the People's Liberation Army?
I think there is a danger we read too much into these incidents that happen. And the way the Chinese look at it is these are usually local level incidents which one side does in response to what happened across the perceived line of actual control. And I think usually when China does something, we have this reflexive thinking it's a grand strategy that has some meaning. But I think there's a danger that we read too much into it, and oftentimes it's something that happens in a very specific local context.
Okay, in other words, don't read too much into it, don't explore too deeply as to why it's happening, and yet the truth of the matter, Ambassador Dasgupta, is that President Xi is not just head of the party, he's not just head of the government, he's also ultimately the head of the army. He's chairman of the Central Military Commission. So, is he aware of these incursions? Are they happening without his knowledge of them? And ultimately, what does this tell us about his control over the Chinese army?
Well, these are incidents at the border, and I'm pretty sure that this was not the result of a deliberate decision by the Chinese government. Look, these incursions occur from time to time during the year. If they happen to coincide with a visit, the media tends to play it up, to magnify.
But would the coinciding with the visit be purely coincidental rather than deliberate and intended?
Yes, in this case, I think it's highly unlikely that it was a deliberate provocation or that it was intended.
There's no question of dissonance between the PLA and the president.
I don't believe that there's a major dissonance, and certainly this wouldn't reflect dissonance if there was.
Why did you say not a major dissonance?
No, because what I meant is that these are actions taken by commanders on the ground, relatively low level,
these are not decisions taken in Beijing. That's what at least I believe.
I'm going to go back to you before I move on a little further, Sanjay Baru. Three of my guests have taken a very different view to yours, although they've taken a different view to different degrees, if you know what I mean. But they all disagree with your belief that this is done deliberately, that it's intended to put India in its place. Do you want to respond to them before we move on?
Well, Karan, look, I'm quite amused to see this kind of second guessing of Chinese motives and giving them the benefit of doubt. I'll be quite happy to give them the benefit of doubt, except I don't believe that all this business of autonomous action, particularly when Xi Jinping, who is the most powerful leader China has had since Deng Xiaoping, visiting India. In fact, he is the most powerful Chinese leader to ever visit India, because neither Mao nor Deng ever came to India. It's a historic visit, as we have seen all the pictures. For Mr. Modi, it's been a very important visit. So I agree, one shouldn't exaggerate all this. I'm not exaggerating. But I cannot believe that there is no method to this madness. One knows China a little bit, not as much as your other panelists. They are all China experts, I'm not. But whatever little I've seen, and the fact that before Lei Keqiang's visit, we had that major event, and now for this to happen, I would like to understand why, rather than brush it aside and say, no, it's not important, don't exaggerate. I think as an Indian strategist, we need to understand what is the signaling, what is the message. Maybe the message is not that China is trying to flex its muscles, but I certainly think the message is to tell us that this bilateral relationship has this huge unresolved issue of the border. And we have fundamental differences.
All right, let's move on. You've raised an issue of concern, and it's certainly one that the audience should be aware of, and there are clearly differences of interpretation or differences of response, not just in India, but also from within my panel itself. Let's move on, and let's come, in fact, to Siddharth Varadarajan, the very spectacular welcome that greeted the Chinese president when he arrived yesterday in Ahmedabad. Mr. Modi himself established a new protocol by flying down to greet his Chinese guest. Do you think we have the makings of a special Modi-Xi relationship, similar to, if not the same as, the Modi-Abe relationship?
Within the confines, the highly formal nature of the Chinese political leadership, I think the meeting in Ahmedabad, the chemistry, the visuals that we saw, the interaction, clearly demonstrates some effort from the Indian side and the Chinese side to establish a rapport, personal rapport of some kind or the other. This is important for both countries for the simple reason that for the next 5 years, perhaps longer, these two gentlemen are going to be in charge of their country's destinies. And they will be the primary interlocutors. They have an ambitious agenda of national, to build up the national economy. That's the stated agenda. And there's plenty that the two sides could do together if, as Modi said today, you can overcome distrust, you can respect each other's sensitivities, then the sky is the limit in terms of what you can do on the economic field. So I think that the beginning of the trip, the way in which it was choreographed was excellent. I think that it was a good gesture on Modi's part and on Xi Jinping's part to begin the visit there in that manner. Ultimately, of course, it's the substantive outcomes that are really going to count. The Chinese promises of 20 billion, to what extent will that be delivered? But I think it was a great beginning, which to my mind was not diminished by media excitement over what's happening on the boundary. I think today the Chinese president made a pretty substantial speech at Ikwa, and the remarks that both principals made were very forward-looking.
Anand Krishnan, I want to put two questions to you. First of all, the Chinese have always treated Mr. Modi with special honor. He's not only visited the country 4 times, I believe, as chief minister, but he was even welcomed in the Great Hall of the People when he went as chief minister, something that is usually reserved for heads of government. Do they see Narendra Modi as special?
I think they might not see Narendra Modi as special, but I think what they see is the chance to do something different with the relationship. I think there was a feeling that after 10 years of the UPA, especially towards the end, I think the relationship had sort of hit a roadblock. And I think what they wanted to do soon after Modi took over was try and see how far they could push a change in the relationship, which was why that weeks after he took over, they sent their foreign minister to Delhi, which is something they don't usually do. So I think more than Modi being special, they wanted to see how far they could go in trying to sort of realign this relationship.
That says by implication that the Chinese are looking to change the relationship and were perhaps taking an initiative in doing just that. Anand?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I lost
I said
you for a
your
second.
answer suggests that the Chinese are looking for a way of changing the relationship, and the visit of their foreign minister just days after Mr. Modi took over, and then today this high-profile visit that's underway, suggests that in fact the Chinese want to take an initiative to change the nature of the relationship.
I think absolutely, and I think a part of it is sourced from the troubles that they're having elsewhere with their other neighbors. So I think it's pretty essential for China that with what they're dealing with the South China Sea and what they're dealing with Japan isn't repeated along the western frontier. So I think they made a conscious effort to try and ensure that India, which was just described as a swing state, very much remains so.
Now, very quickly, I noticed that President Xi, and in fact the whole country has been bedazzled by her, came along with his wife, Peng Liyuan. She's clearly taken young Indian students by storm, but is it not uncommon for Chinese presidents and prime ministers to be accompanied by their spouses? Is this not a rarity, and therefore is this particularly significant?
I think it's been something interesting the way Xi Jinping is trying to present a very different image of China. It is rare in the sense that neither Hu Jintao nor Jiang Zemin, his true predecessors, traveled with their spouses. And I think that's partly the unspoken code, which is it's a collective leadership and no leader should sort of personalize it too much. But ever since Xi's taken over, it's been since November 2012, he's done things very differently. And I think it also goes to show the kind of special space he occupies in being probably the most powerful leader China has in the last 2 generations of its leadership.
Okay. Let's move, Ambassador Dasgupta, to in fact the great economic hopes that this visit has engendered and to what extent they're going to be fulfilled. Before the Chinese president arrived, perhaps on the basis of leaks put out by Chinese diplomats, there was speculation that India would be receiving something like $100 billion of Chinese investment. Today it's been announced that what we're getting is $20 billion over 5 years. After the hype, is that disappointing, or in view of the fact that over the last 10 years, all that China has invested is just $400 million, is the $20 billion figure actually a huge increase?
It's a huge increase. It's a very, very substantial figure. And $100 billion always sounded unreal. So it's good that we have a more realistic figure to work on.
But when you say it's a more realistic figure, how much of this is going to be government to government? In other words, Chinese government investment? And how much of it will be business to business? Or is the business to business component, to some Indians are speculating, separate to the 20 billion and therefore additional to the 20 billion?
No, as far as I know, it is not separate. It's part of that. You know, it's easy to sign MOUs in any amount. It means nothing. That's just a statement of intent. But in this case of the $20 billion, it's being connected to specific initiatives, particularly the new industrial zones in Gujarat and Maharashtra. So this has a more real sound to it than these sort of astronomical figures like $100 billion.
Sanjay Baru, I can't help but draw a comparison between the Chinese wanting to invest 20 billion and just 2 weeks ago the Japanese announcing that they were going to invest over the same 5-year period 35 billion. And I noticed that in fact yesterday Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, pointedly sent a tweet to Mr. Modi, purportedly wishing him happy birthday, but also reminding him of the great time the two had together in Kyoto and Tokyo. Is there an incipient Chinese-Japanese rivalry for economic investment in India and to win Mr. Modi's favor? Or am I exaggerating and seeing too much in it?
Oh, I sincerely pray for such rivalry. You know, I wish the whole world competes with each other to invest in India. As an Indian, I would love that situation where the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese are all wanting to come and invest in India to befriend us. So I look forward to that day. I wish that was true. I think our real challenge is to be able to absorb that investment. When that 20 billion comes, when that 35 billion comes, Our system, our bureaucracy, our legal system, this country has to absorb all of that investment. But I certainly welcome this global competition.
Can I put something to you, Siddharth Vardarajan? These figures of 35 billion in the case of the Japanese, 20 billion in the case of the Chinese are not just startling in terms of their quantum, but they are commitments that you never saw during the 10 years of UPA government. Is this then a particular feather in Mr. Modi's cap that he's been able within 3.5, 4 months to get the Japanese and the Chinese to make upfront commitments of this order?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think that they have taken very seriously his promise to the electorate of reviving the growth rate of the Indian economy and giving a boost to growth and development. And they are, putting their money behind their belief. In the case of the Chinese, I think there's an additional factor here. During the Manmohan Singh, because it was a politically weak government, they were very reticent to accept Chinese investment in a whole range of sectors. Now, one can understand ports, one can understand even telecom switching equipment. But when the security agencies would object to the sale or installation of Chinese aero bridges in Indian airports on security grounds, there was a limit to this kind of paranoia. I think they are confident that given the kind of strength Modi has politically, he will take a more rational approach towards Chinese investment in India. Okay. And the 400 million figure, which is abysmal, is very low. I think even if it doesn't hit 20 billion, will certainly, provided the political comfort level of the two leaders remains and the two countries remain, I think the chances are that you will see substantial investment in infrastructure in these two zones. But I suspect the Chinese are very keen, for example, on high-speed rail. There's discussion. There was an MOU signed for the rail sector. I suspect these are areas where we are going to see some substantial Chinese investment.
Anand Krishnan, as someone who sits in Beijing and understands the Chinese investor better than all of us, where do you think the Chinese are most likely to want to invest their money? The media in India believes that the focus is likely to be on railways, infrastructure, electronics and plastics. Would you agree? Would you want to add to that list? Would you want to subtract from it?
Yeah, I think in the last 10 years, power and telecom have been the two areas of focus. And as Siddharth just mentioned, I think they found that they ran into too many obstacles with the previous UPA government. So I think the hope is that with this industrial park that's going to be focusing on the power sector in Gujarat, that they sort of overcome that one hurdle. And I think you pretty much covered the other sectors. I think railways is something where they've been pushing very hard. The MOUs have confirmed that they will play a role in developing stations as well as raising the speeds on existing rail lines. I think the Chinese have been somewhat disappointed that on the high-speed rail or the bullet train sector, it hasn't moved as quickly as they'd hoped for, because we signed an agreement with Japan. And I think we sort of delayed the process by saying in the current MOU that we will do a feasibility study with China, but we haven't gone further than that.
Okay. Now, in the case, Ambassador Das Gupta, of the Japanese, Mr. Modi pointedly announced, and he did so in Japan itself, that he was setting up a special mechanism in his office with Japanese representation on it to speedily clear Japanese investments in this country. So far as I can tell, there is no such agreement. Certainly, there's no announcement of such an agreement in the Chinese case. But do you think he would need one if that vast figure of 20 billion is actually going to be achieved in 5 simple years?
Frankly, I'm not in a position to comment on that. I don't know exactly what the complications are which would arise in the case of the Chinese. But I think the question you've raised is a very good one, and it probably requires very early consideration.
Because otherwise the Chinese are going to face the same bureaucratic hassles and hurdles that the Japanese were worried about and often put off by. Yes. And to overcome Japanese apprehensions, he decided to create the special mechanism. Surely he needs to do the same thing, because otherwise 20 billion is so large a figure, India simply won't be able to handle it, leave aside, absorb it.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable argument, yes.
Let me put to you very quickly, Sanjay Baru, a question which I'm addressing not as a strategist but as an economist, which you also are. From India's point of view, this investment is particularly welcome because it will help bridge the huge balance of payments deficit between the two countries, which I'm told now is fast approaching somewhere like $38–39 billion. Do you believe that in fact it will have a major impact in a fairly short, quick term, or is this something that's not going to make the bridge till at least 5, 6, 7, 8 years are past?
Well, it would have, provided the Chinese investment comes into areas where the trade deficit can be reduced. In other words, China, instead of importing raw materials from India, manufactures them here and exports them out. That China contributes to India's exports and not just sells in the Indian market. If that happens, then China can use investment as an instrument to reduce the trade deficit.
Can I ask you then
The fact is that the trade deficit is a big issue.
Can I ask you this is a follow-up
Both
question?
Anand Sharma
Can I ask you this is a follow-up question?
Yeah, sorry.
What are the chances that rising labor costs in China will actually encourage Chinese investors, both of the private sector and the government sector, to choose to manufacture in India, to do what Mr. Modi calls made in India, and then using India as a manufacturing hub, export to the world? What are the chances that will happen?
Well, you know, Karan, there is no real private sector in China. Even the private companies, their investment decisions would be influenced by government thinking. So at the end of the day, it's the Chinese government which would direct Chinese companies, public sector and partly private owned ones, whether they should be investing in India and how. Now, it is true that India's labor costs are lower, but it's not a particularly great advantage that we have given all the other minuses in India in terms of infrastructure, etc. But I think the Chinese need to address the trade deficit issue. It's a problem raised by the previous UPA government, it's been raised by the present BJP government. And I think if China can use investments as a way of reducing the trade deficit, that would add to the relationship. It would improve the relationship.
Okay. Very quickly, Anand Krishnan, how conscious is China of the fact that the trade deficit is a big worry for Indian politicians, and that if it is not addressed, and if it's not addressed by Chinese taking steps themselves, that could be an obstacle to the improvement of the ties?
Oh, I think they're very aware of that. Especially because bilateral trade has actually fallen in the last 2 years, and it sort of punctured a myth in this story that the India-China trade relationship was sort of driving the whole reason for both countries to have good ties. So I think after 2 years of declines in net bilateral trade, and which still didn't prevent the trade deficit from growing, I think it's come to the point of almost being an issue of alarm, that they have to do something fundamental to change the way trade's being done.
Okay. In other words, the Chinese are conscious, the Indians feel a need for this problem to be addressed, so hopefully the two will meet together and something will happen. Let's